Written by you/ItsTimeLadies. I see a boy whenever somebody dies. The third and final encounter. I was 15 when I saw him for the third time. In all the time in between I never told anyone about him. I was positive nobody would believe me if I did. Whenever my stepfamily would take me out with them, I would always focus on the crowds of people wherever we went to see if I could make out a boy with silver hair. My aunt is a nurse, and I remember I'd volunteer to go to her hospital with her whenever possible, and spend hours walking down the hallways to see if I could spot him. They were nice to me. They tried their best to welcome me into their family, even though I hadn't seen them since Mom's funeral. That being said though, they always seemed to have their hands busy, if not with their jobs then with my older cousin. She was a wild child, as they would call her. She loved going out in the night to party, coming home in the early morning stumbling and disoriented. They tried their best to make her keep up with schoolwork, but she would never listen. She graduated high school with a D average, and dropped out of college after one semester. She would occasionally go to live with a boyfriend, but they'd never work out, and she always came back to live with my aunt and uncle because they were too nice to kick her out. I didn't talk to her much, given that she was so much older than I. The last notable interaction I had with her was on my 14th birthday, when she offered to give me a sip of her vodka when my aunt and uncle weren't in the room. Remembering what my father was like when he drank and scared I'd be the same way, I declined. She didn't really talk to me afterward. Then, 1 year later, as I was walking to my room one night, I noticed her door was open, and I could hear a man's voice whispering something from inside, accompanied by the sound of her moaning. I rolled my eyes, and sped up so I wouldn't have to hear too much of whatever they were doing. Then, to my surprise, she suddenly stopped, and I could hear footsteps. I froze as I saw that the person walking out of the room was the boy, walking towards me causally with his eyes closed and his hands in his pockets. He opened his eyes when he realized I'd been standing there, before smiling and giving me a finger gun. Then, he passed me and strolled downstairs, out of my sight. I stood there dumbly for a few seconds before snapping back to reality. I wanted to run after him, but I turned to look back at my cousin's room. Hesitantly, I walked towards it and peeked inside, to see my cousin lying in her bed in an uncomfortable-looking position. Her head was draped over the side, and her eyes blank and glassy gazed right into mine. Sighing, I called my aunt and uncle up to the room. Apparently one of her friends managed to get a hold of some sort of high-end painkillers, and lended her some. She took too many at once, and mixed in alcohol as well. You can probably guess what happened after that. My aunt and uncle were devastated, obviously. I remember hearing at least one of them crying every day for about a month afterward. I think they blamed themselves for it. For my part, and I'll sound terrible for this, I know I was less bothered by her death as much as the way the boy acted. He didn't even say anything to me. He gave me a fucking finger gun. If I'm ashamed to admit it made me feel worse than my own cousin's death, I'm mortified to say it made me cry. My aunt and uncle became stricter with me afterward, even though they didn't really need to be. I had no interest in any of that stuff. But they made sure I stayed in school until I managed to graduate community college, and they gave me enough money to be able to move out into a small apartment. The apartment wasn't great, it was smelly and the pipes made a lot of noise, but it was nice. It was where I lived until the last time I met the boy. I'd been living by myself for about 3 years by that point. My life had gotten a bit depressing, I guess you could say. I never bothered to go to university after finishing community college. In spite of my aunt and uncle's egging it on, there were no academic fields that interested me. I got a job at a tire factory, because I found the repetitive process of making them over and over was relaxing to me. I didn't have to think about anything. I got decent money, but I stayed in that little apartment. I never really went out, and I never talked to anyone because I didn't have anything to say. I had talks with my aunt and uncle every now and then, but they had become less frequent lately, as I suppose they started to get tired of the fact that nothing in my life was changing. I thought about the boy a lot. Sometimes, I would go up to the roof of my apartment and stand on the ledge looking down, just to see if he would appear. He never did, because I was always too afraid to jump. Last night I had a dream that I was backseat of the van on that fateful day. My mom yelling at my brother, no longer needing to lean forward as her neck was twisted at an angle that she could look back at him while still sitting comfortably. My brother was yelling something back, but as his jaw was dislocated and his face bloated from bruising, it was difficult to make out what. My father drove silently, having to wipe the steering wheel down occasionally whenever the blood seeping from his wrists made it too slick. My sister sobbed in her seat, though I was unsure if it was from the commotion, or from the crater my dad's fist left on her forehead. After a while though the car stopped and they all went silent. I looked out the window to see that we'd parked at that grocery store. Slowly, they all unbuckled their seatbelts and opened their doors, stepping out into the lot and walking towards the entrance, leaving me behind. I watched them go from my window, until I couldn't see them anymore. When they were out of my sight I sat back down in my seat, and noticed a figure sitting in the passenger seat. Looking up, I saw that it was the boy, looking back at me with a sad smile. "Ready to go with them, buddy?" he asked. "Yeah," I said casually, without a second thought. He seemed surprised, but the smile remained on his face. "All right then," he said, before crawling into the middle section with his hand reaching out to me. As it got closer, I could feel myself getting hotter, until I woke up and sweating right as his fingers were about to graze me. After taking a deep breath, I sighed and looked up to the ceiling. I knew what I needed to do. In the morning I got into my car and drove 20 minutes to my old town, until I found that grocery store. I parked near the entrance, and sat there with my eyes closed for a few moments, before my nose was filled with that familiar smell of a dying fire. "Hey man," I heard him say. "Long time no see." I opened eyes to see him sitting in the passenger seat, looking at me with a smile that seemed a bit strained. He didn't look any older than the last time I saw him. "Hi," I replied. We both sat in silence for a few moments, before I took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. "Are you here for me this time?" "Afraid so," he answered, looking rather guilty as he did. "Is it going to be in there?" I asked, motioning towards the store. "Nah," he said, "actually, you didn't even need to come all the way out here. I appreciate the drama of it though." "Oh. Well, if this is happening then there are some things I want to know," I said, trying to sound firm. He made a gesture for me to continue, and I paused before asking the first thing that came to my head: why could I see you that day when Mom died, and nobody else could? He looked thoughtful for a moment, before merely shrugging. "Beats me," he said, "it just happens sometimes. I'll touch a person thinking they won't feel it, only for them to turn around and ask what I'm doing." He chuckled, looking embarrassed. "It can get pretty awkward." "What are you?" I asked, cutting him off. "Just a guy doing his job, like anyone else," he said, trying to sound casual. "Humans are unpredictable, you know. Guys like me have to wrangle you, make sure you're in the right place when you're supposed to kick it, so there's more of you?" He seemed to think that one was amusing. "Bro, there's millions of us," he said with a chuckle. "You think I could deal with every death in the world by myself? Hell, I just barely managed to make sure you didn't the dust that night." My eyes widened as I realized what he meant. "So, that's why you saved me from my dad?" His face faltered, and he looked away. "I didn't save you," he said, sounding a bit remorseful. "You were never supposed to die. I was just making sure you didn't." "Oh," I said once again, and I couldn't deny I felt a bit disappointed. "So that's why you wanted to play with me?" "Well yeah. But also," he looked back to me, and the smile returned to his face, "you seemed lonely. I thought you may have wanted to talk to someone." I sat silently as I processed this. After a while, I started the engine and backed out of the parking lot. "Will I die at home?" I asked him as I got on the road. "Yep," was his only response. "What if I don't go back? What if I just keep driving?" "Do you want to do that?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "No," I said, "I guess I don't." We drove along the highway for the next 20 minutes as he explained what would happen to me. I would go home and, feeling tired from my day, I would take a nap, but not before lighting a few candles to block out the smell of the apartment. As I was sleeping, the apartment's old pipes would finally give out, causing a gas leak. When the gas catches in the flame, it'll cause an explosion that burns my side of the apartment down. While others would be injured, I was to be the only casualty. Finally, we made it back to the apartment. "I guess this is it," I said, doing my best to accept that I'd be dead in just a few hours. "I guess so," the boy replied. Then he looked back at me and asked, "Since you've been bothering me with questions all day, can I ask you one?" I nodded my head and he leaned forward. "What's your name?" They never give his names, and I always wanted to know. I was a bit surprised by that. "Trent," I answered. "What's yours?" He seemed to think about it for a moment, before looking back at me and smiling. "I don't know," he said, "give me one." I stared at him for a second, unsure of how to respond, when the smell gave me an idea. "How about Ash?" I asked. He looked at me in silence for a moment, before he started giggling. "Creative one, aren't you?" he asked as he continued to laugh. Pretty soon I started laughing too. I couldn't remember the last time I laughed. We stopped soon enough though, and I knew it was time. I unbuckled and stepped out of the car, heading toward my apartment. Ash came to my side as I opened the door, and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. His touch was surprisingly warm,